It began on a bright Saturday morning, when the air felt unusually heavy for a neighborhood that prided itself on peace and order. The lawns were perfectly trimmed, flower beds lined like soldiers on parade, and every house seemed to follow the same unspoken rule of perfection. Yet in the middle of that carefully curated postcard image, a small rescue dog named Gus was finding his place in the world. Gus wasn't the kind of dog you saw in glossy pet magazines. His fur was patchy, his ears uneven, and his walk had a slight wobble from an old injury. But his eyes, deep, soulful pools, held the kind of warmth only a creature that had known hardship could carry. The day he first barked in the neighborhood, it wasn't loud or threatening. It was simply the joyful sound of a dog testing his new surroundings. But in a place where even the volume of lawnmowers seemed regulated, that bark was enough to draw unwanted attention. From across the street, a curtain shifted. A pale face framed by perfectly styled blonde hair appeared briefly in the gap, then vanished. That was the first sighting of her, the woman whose name would later become synonymous with neighborhood drama. Karen lived 3 houses down, in a place so meticulously maintained that even her driveway looked freshly polished. Her reputation for controlling the smallest details of community life was already the stuff of whispered stories. She had once demanded a neighbor repaint their front door because the shade of blue clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. She had written anonymous notes about trash cans being left out 2 minutes too long. And now, it seemed, she had found her next crusade. For the first few days, nothing happened. Gus enjoyed the backyard, trotting along the fence line with his tail wagging. His owner thought nothing of it, but subtle shifts began to ripple through the calm. Flyers appeared on the HOA bulletin board reminding residents about acceptable pet standards. The HOA monthly email contained a vague paragraph about ensuring all pets were well, groomed, and in line with community image. It didn't name names, but the timing made the target clear. Then came the first official notice. A neatly folded paper slipped into the mailbox carried the HOA letterhead. It stated that several residents had expressed concerns about a pet that did not meet neighborhood expectations. No further details were given, but the implication was sharp. The wording hinted at the possibility of fines if the issue wasn't addressed. The morning after receiving the notice, Gus's owner saw Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, talking to another neighbor. Their glances drifted toward the house, followed by the faintest shake of Karen's head. That was the moment it became obvious that this wasn't going to fade quietly. Karen wasn't just passively disapproving, she was organizing. Within a week, more whispers began to circulate. Someone overheard Karen referring to Gus as an eyesore during a conversation at the local park. Another claimed she was petitioning the HOA to require visual approval of all pets before they could reside in the neighborhood. It sounded absurd, but in a place where the color of your shutters could spark a heated debate, it wasn't beyond belief. The tension grew in small, almost imperceptible ways. The air seemed to tighten whenever Gus was walked past certain houses. A few neighbors stopped waving hello. A fresh wave of HOA notices reminded residents that violations could result in penalties, and Karen's presence became a constant shadow, sometimes watching from her porch, sometimes appearing by coincidence, whenever Gus was outside. But there was one thing Karen hadn't counted on. Gus's owner wasn't easily intimidated. The idea of being forced to give up a dog, especially one rescued from neglect, was unthinkable. This wasn't going to end with a quiet surrender. If Karen wanted a battle over the neighborhood's image, then a battle she would get. The first step was observation. Patterns were noted, small details filed away for later use. Which neighbors sided with Karen, which remained neutral, and which seemed uncomfortable with the whole thing. Evidence was gathered: photos of Gus behaving perfectly well, records of vet visits showing he was healthy, and even a copy of the HOA bylaws highlighting that there was no rule about a pet's appearance. Still, the storm was building. A rumor reached Gus's owner that Karen was planning to bring the issue up at the next HOA meeting in a very public way. It would be the perfect stage for her, a room full of residents, the HOA board watching, and the opportunity to put pressure on someone she viewed as defying the neighborhood's unwritten laws. As the date of the meeting drew closer, the quiet days of simply walking the dog and minding one's own business were gone. Every interaction in the neighborhood carried the weight of the coming confrontation. Gus's owner knew that whatever happened in that meeting would decide whether this was just another petty HOA squabble, or the start of a much bigger war. The night before the meeting, the neighborhood was eerily still. Porch lights glowed like watchful eyes, and somewhere far off, a sprinkler hissed rhythmically in the dark. Inside, Gus slept soundly, unaware of the battle about to unfold on his behalf. His owner, however, was very aware and was ready to make sure Karen's plan didn't go the way she expected. The stage was set. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a spotless room with beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and an atmosphere that always felt like it was waiting for conflict to break out. The rows of folding chairs filled slowly as neighbors trickled in, murmuring to one another in low voices. The smell of burnt coffee from the corner refreshment table mingled with the faint scent of carpet cleaner, a reminder of how the HOA prized appearances above all else. By the time the meeting began, every seat was taken. Karen arrived fashionably late, striding in with a binder clutched under one arm. Her outfit, crisp and coordinated, seemed calculated to project authority. She took a seat near the front, offering tight smiles to her allies in the room. Her eyes briefly swept over Gus's owner, and then moved on as if dismissing them entirely. The HOA president began with the usual agenda: budget updates, landscaping schedules, community events. But the tension in the room made it clear that no one was truly paying attention. Everyone was waiting for the moment they knew was coming. It arrived under the vague heading of community concerns. Karen stood, clearing her throat in a way that made several heads turn. She began to speak with measured calm, but there was a sharpness beneath every word. She talked about standards, about the importance of preserving the neighborhood's visual integrity, and about how certain recent additions to the community were not in keeping with its aesthetic values. Though she never said Gus's name, there was no mistaking who she meant. She described a pet that looked neglected, implying it might deter potential home buyers. She made a show of suggesting it was a sensitive issue, pretending her concern was purely for the neighborhood's best interests. The performance was meticulous, enough to sway those who didn't know the full story. A few neighbors nodded in agreement, but others shifted uncomfortably. The HOA president tried to keep the conversation neutral, asking if there were any actual violations of the bylaws. Karen responded by waving a stack of papers in the air, claiming to have documented evidence of her concerns. What she didn't expect was for Gus's owner to be equally prepared. When the president opened the floor, a calm but firm response came in the form of clear, undeniable facts. The bylaws were read aloud, line by line, highlighting that there was no rule regarding a pet's appearance. Veterinary records were presented, showing Gus was healthy, vaccinated, and well cared for. Photos of him playing gently in the yard, walking on a leash, and interacting calmly with neighbors were passed around. The room shifted, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. A few people who had been silent started murmuring words like overreaction and ridiculous. Karen's expression tightened, but she pressed on, insisting it was still about standards and future property values. But this time, her words didn't land the same way. The more she tried to frame the situation as a community issue, the more it became clear that it was personal. She had singled out one neighbor and one dog, without any legitimate rule to back her claims. The HOA president finally stepped in, reminding everyone that the board could not enforce non-existent rules. The matter officially was closed, but the atmosphere told another story. Karen had not gotten her victory, and for someone like her, losing in front of an audience was not something she would forget or forgive. As people filed out of the meeting, a few stopped to quietly offer support to Gus's owner. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to take sides openly. But one thing was certain, the conflict had just escalated. That night, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath again. Porch lights blinked off one by one. The streets went quiet, but in certain windows, shadows lingered longer than usual, as though watching and waiting. Karen had been publicly challenged and publicly denied. That kind of defeat didn't just disappear, it simmered. And in the days to come, it would boil over in ways no one could have predicted. The first sign came less than 48 hours later. A subtle but unmistakable act that made it clear this wasn't over. It started with something small. One morning, Gus's water bowl on the front porch was overturned, its contents soaking into the welcome mat. At first, it was easy to chalk it up to the wind or a stray animal. But the very next day, a neatly printed flyer was taped to the front door. It had no name, no signature, just a generic stock photo of a well-groomed dog with the words, "This is what a neighborhood pet should look like." The message was clear and it was personal. It is as though reality POLII to SHED and SELF is Freya at polling edges. Retaliation often came in these quiet, calculated forms. Karen was too clever to risk an outright violation herself. Instead, she preferred to make life subtly uncomfortable, pushing just far enough to cause frustration, but not far enough to leave obvious evidence. Within a week, more of these small inconveniences began stacking up. The trash can was moved from its spot by the curb and tipped over. Only Gus's house was affected. The HOA landscaping crew accidentally skipped trimming the front hedges for 2 weeks in a row, leaving them noticeably uneven compared to the rest of the street. A mysterious anonymous complaint was filed with animal control, alleging that Gus was dangerous. When the officer arrived, he found a gentle, tail-wagging dog and a clean yard, but the message was clear: someone wanted to cause trouble. The most unnerving part wasn't the acts themselves, it was the feeling of being watched. Every time Gus was let outside, there was a sense of eyes tracking him from somewhere unseen. Sometimes it was from behind half-closed blinds. Other times it was a figure lingering just long enough on a morning walk to make the air feel heavy. But Gus's owner refused to be intimidated. Instead, a decision was made to document everything. Security cameras went up, 2 in the front, 1 in the backyard. A small notebook was kept by the door to log every strange occurrence. Dates, times, and descriptions filled the pages. If this was going to become a war, then there would be a record of every shot fired. Karen seemed to notice the cameras immediately. Her smiles grew tighter, her waves more mechanical. Yet the petty actions continued. Someone left an anonymous envelope in the mailbox with cut-out letters from magazines spelling the words "Move Out." It was childish, but also unsettling in its obsession. Despite the tension, something interesting began to happen. A few neighbors, ones who had previously stayed neutral, started to speak up quietly in passing. They had noticed the strange treatment. They had their own stories of Karen's past harassment. A whispered network began to form, a slow, building undercurrent of people who were growing tired of the unspoken control she held over the neighborhood. But Karen still had influence, and she wasn't done. One afternoon, a new sign appeared at the HOA bulletin board. It announced an upcoming Pet Appreciation Day at the community park, a cheerful event on paper, but with a twist. At the bottom, in smaller print, it stated that there would be a Best in Show contest, judged by the HOA board. It was subtle, but for anyone who knew the backstory, the message was obvious. This was her stage, her chance to humiliate Gus in front of the entire community without ever saying his name. It was a move that revealed both her confidence and her desperation. She was betting on public embarrassment to force her opponent into submission, but she had underestimated one thing. Gus's owner was not playing defense anymore. Plans began to take shape, quietly and methodically. If Karen wanted a public stage, then the stage would be used against her. The cameras, the notes, the petty acts, everything was part of the preparation. And when the day of the event came, the neighborhood would see more than just a contest. They would see the truth. For now, though, the air in the neighborhood felt charged, like the moments before a summer storm. Every routine action, taking out the trash, walking the dog, picking up mail, carried an edge. The quiet streets no longer felt friendly. They felt like a chessboard, and every move mattered. And in the center of it all, Karen watched and waited, certain she was in control. She didn't realize the game was about to turn on her completely. The morning of Pet Appreciation Day arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze that carried the scent of fresh, cut grass from the community park. White folding tents lined the field, each with cheerful banners flapping lightly in the wind. Long tables displayed rows of cupcakes, lemonade pitchers, and trays of dog treats shaped like bones. It looked harmless, picturesque even. But beneath the surface, the event buzzed with unspoken tension. Karen was already there when Gus's owner arrived. She stood near the judging table, her hair perfectly styled, her clipboard in hand, looking like the self-appointed queen of the day. She moved between groups of neighbors, shaking hands, laughing at small jokes, and making sure everyone knew she had been instrumental in organizing the event. Her allies clustered nearby, their smiles a little too tight, their glances a little too quick toward the dog they had been gossiping about for weeks. Gus, however, trotted into the park without a care in the world. His uneven ears perked forward, his mismatched fur catching the sunlight in a way that made him look almost golden. He sniffed the grass, wagged his tail, and greeted anyone who came near with quiet curiosity. He didn't know this was supposed to be his trial. The competition was simple on paper. Pets would parade in front of the judges, who would then award ribbons for categories like Best Groomed, Most Playful, and, of course, Best in Show. But everyone knew that the unspoken goal, at least for Karen, was to turn the Best in Show a moment into a veiled jab. What she didn't know was that Gus's owner had been preparing for this day for weeks. The security footage of Karen's petty acts, the anonymous letters, the vandalized porch items, they had been carefully compiled into a short, discreet video. A projector and portable screen, borrowed from a supportive neighbor, sat in the back of a nearby SUV, ready to be rolled out when the time was right. The plan wasn't just to win, it was to make the truth undeniable. The judging began. Golden retrievers with gleaming coats, poodles with perfect curls, and sleek greyhounds strutted past the crowd, each earning polite applause. Karen herself handed out some of the ribbons, her voice warm and encouraging, her smile flawless. But her eyes flickered each time they drifted toward Gus. When Gus's turn came, there was a ripple through the audience. Some people smiled genuinely, others tilted their heads in quiet judgment. Gus didn't strut, he ambled, tail swaying lazily, stopping once to sniff the grass before continuing. He wasn't polished or symmetrical, but his calm, steady presence stood out. A few children giggled and clapped for him, drawn to his gentle demeanor. The judges scribbled notes, their expressions unreadable. Karen leaned forward slightly, lips pressed into what might have been the ghost of a smirk. It was almost time for the Best in Show announcement, her intended moment of triumph. But before the ribbons could be handed out, Gus's owner stepped forward and asked for just a few minutes of the crowd's attention. There was a brief hesitation, but the HOA president, unaware of what was coming, nodded. From the SUV, the screen and projector were quickly set up. The crowd murmured, curious. Then the video began. First came the security footage. Clear images of a figure, unmistakably Karen, walking near the porch late at night. The screen showed the water bowl being tipped, the mailbox being opened and closed without delivering anything, the mysterious flyers being taped to the door. Then came the close-up shots of the anonymous letter with cut-out magazine words. Finally, the footage of Gus peacefully sitting, playing, wagging his tail, ran side by side with the official HOA pet guidelines that contained no rule about appearance. The murmurs grew louder. People glanced between the screen and Karen, whose face had gone pale beneath her careful makeup. A few neighbors crossed their arms, others shook their heads. The atmosphere had shifted completely. By the time the video ended, the meaning was clear. This hadn't been about neighborhood standards at all. It had been a personal vendetta, executed with petty cruelty. Karen stood frozen for a moment, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on her. The HOA president, visibly uncomfortable, announced that the contest would proceed but added that personal disputes should never overshadow community events. The Best in Show ribbon went fittingly to Gus. The applause was loud not just for the dog, but for the quiet victory over someone who had used the HOA as a weapon. Karen didn't clap. She didn't even stay to watch the rest of the awards. She gathered her clipboard and left, her retreat witnessed by every person in the park. But even as the sunlight warmed the field and Gus sat proudly with his ribbon, there was an unspoken understanding. Karen wasn't the type to let humiliation end the fight. She would retreat for now, but only to plan her next move, and that next move would come sooner than anyone expected. In the days after Pet Appreciation Day, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. Conversations at the mailbox were shorter, Waves from passing cars felt hesitant, and the air carried an awkward tension, as if everyone was waiting to see what Karen would do next. For nearly a week, she seemed to vanish from public life. No morning walks past Gus's house. No clipboard appearances at the HOA office. No curtain shifts from her living room window. Some thought the humiliation had finally broken her grip on the community. Others, especially those who had crossed paths with her before, knew better. Karen wasn't defeated. She was reloading. The first strike came quietly. A thick envelope arrived in Gus's owner's mailbox, bearing the logo of the county zoning office. Inside was a formal notice. An anonymous complaint had been filed alleging that multiple animals were being kept on the property without proper permits. The accusation was absurd. There was only Gus. But it triggered an automatic inspection. 2 uniformed officers arrived a few days later, walking through the yard, taking photos, and asking questions. They left without finding a violation, but their visit set the tone for what was to come. The second strike was financial. An unexpected letter from the HOA claimed that several months of dues were unpaid, despite proof of regular payments. When confronted, the HOA treasurer admitted that someone had flagged the account as delinquent, triggering late fees. The error was corrected, but the damage was done. Karen had found ways to weaponize paperwork and bureaucracy. The third strike was social. Karen began hosting small gatherings at her home, inviting the neighbors most likely to side with her. From the outside, they looked like casual wine nights, but inside they were strategy sessions. Rumors began to circulate again, this time not just about Gus, but about his owner. Stories about unruly behavior, property neglect, and arguments with delivery drivers started to spread. None of it was true, but in a tightly wound community, repeated whispers could plant seeds of doubt. Even the physical space around the house began to change. Lawn service crews suddenly started edging the grass in strange, uneven lines along the property boundary, making it look untidy. A landscaping company left a note saying they'd been informed the house would be undergoing a yard overhaul, and to expect noise, something Gus's owner had never requested. It was clear now, Karen wasn't just retaliating. She was trying to make living in the neighborhood unbearable. She wasn't fighting in the open anymore. She was waging a cold, quiet war through systems, social pressure, and inconvenience. But what she didn't know was that every move she made was still being documented. Every suspicious letter, every altered bill, every piece of misdirected landscaping photographed, filed, and dated. The growing evidence wasn't just for defense anymore. It was part of a bigger plan. The final straw came late one Friday evening. Gus's owner stepped outside to find a sign planted in the front yard. It was handmade with uneven lettering reading, "HOA violator bad for the neighborhood." A smear of mud streaked the bottom corner as if it had been hastily placed. That sign crossed a line. It wasn't just passive-aggressive. It was public defamation, and it provided the one thing that had been missing until now: undeniable, tangible proof of harassment that even the HOA couldn't ignore. The decision was made that night. No more waiting for Karen to make the next move. No more quiet documentation. It was time to turn every piece of evidence into a weapon, not just to win against her, but to make sure she could never pull this kind of stunt on anyone again. Plans for a neighborhood-wide reckoning began to take shape. It would involve the HOA board, county officials, and every neighbor who had ever been on the receiving end of Karen's bullying. The idea wasn't just to defend Gus. It was to dismantle the network of fear she had built. And the moment to strike back would come at the most public HOA event of the year. The annual HOA barbecue was the crown jewel of the neighborhood's social calendar. It wasn't just about burgers and lemonade, it was about appearances. Families dressed neatly, kids played in organized games, and every tablecloth matched the HOA official color scheme. Even the food had rules. Anything store-bought had to be plated on approved serving dishes. Karen thrived at this event. She worked the crowd like a politician, shaking hands, introducing herself to new residents, and making sure everyone knew she was deeply involved in maintaining the neighborhood's charm. But this year, her usual air of control had a faint crack. A few neighbors had stopped attending her gatherings. Some no longer greeted her with the same warmth. The fallout from Pet Appreciation Day still lingered, but she carried herself as if nothing had changed. Gus's owner arrived quietly, carrying a tray of homemade cookies and wearing a calm expression that concealed the storm brewing underneath. Weeks of preparation had led to this moment. Every piece of evidence, videos, photographs, HOA records, and even the sign from the front yard was compiled into a concise, undeniable presentation. And today, the entire neighborhood would see it. The barbecue was already buzzing with activity. Kids darted between picnic tables, a live band played easygoing tunes, and the smell of grilled food drifted through the air. The HOA president stood at the center, calling for attention between games and raffle announcements. This was the natural point where the board would address community matters, a segment that usually involved minor updates or light-hearted reminders. When the microphone was opened for concerns, Gus's owner stepped forward. A few heads turned, Karen's eyes narrowed. The voice that spoke into the microphone was steady and measured. It began not with accusations, but with gratitude for the community and an acknowledgement of how much pride residents took in their homes. Then, it shifted, describing the subtle ways rules and systems could be misused to target individuals. The words were careful, framing the issue not as a personal vendetta, but as a community-wide problem. And then, without fanfare, the portable projector was turned on. The crowd watched as the first clips rolled. Karen on camera, tipping over the water bowl, placing flyers, and peering into the mailbox. The murmurs grew louder with each scene. Next came the document's letters from animal control, HOA delinquency notices, all proven false. Then the photo of the yard sign, placed under the cover of darkness. Side by side with these images were dates, times, and official responses, clearing Gus's owner of any wrongdoing. The final slide was a simple statement: "This is not how a community treats its neighbors." Silence hung in the air for a moment before whispers and gasps rippled through the crowd. Eyes turned toward Karen, who stood frozen, her posture rigid, her hands clutching a paper plate so tightly it bent in half. The HOA president, visibly uncomfortable, took the microphone. He announced that an emergency board review would be called to address serious concerns about harassment and misuse of HOA authority. He reminded everyone that the HOA existed to protect, not to target residents. The implication was clear. Karen's reign was being formally challenged. Karen's usual composure cracked. She muttered something under her breath, turned on her heel, and walked toward the parking lot, leaving her plate of food abandoned on the table. The crowd didn't chase her. In fact, several people stepped aside as she passed, avoiding her gaze. For the rest of the afternoon, the mood felt lighter, almost relieved. Neighbors who had been silent before now openly approached Gus's owner, offering support and sharing their own stories of past run-ins with Karen. Some were even willing to submit statements for the HOA review. By the time the barbecue ended, it was clear that the balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted. Karen was no longer untouchable, but the fight wasn't over yet. The emergency board review would be the final battle, the one that determined whether Karen would face real consequences or find a way to slip back into influence. And Gus's owner was ready to make sure there would be no way back for her. The meeting was called for a Wednesday evening, a time chosen so no one could claim they were too busy to attend. The HOA clubhouse was packed, every folding chair occupied, extra rows of neighbors standing along the back wall. The tension in the room was heavy, but it was different from the last time Gus's owner had stood here. This time, the crowd wasn't waiting to see what Karen would say. They were waiting to see what would happen to her. The board members sat at a long table at the front, their faces serious. In the middle was the HOA president, flanked by the vice president and treasurer. In front of them was a thick folder of printed evidence, photos, letters, and witness statements gathered not just from Gus's owner, but from other residents who had come forward since the barbecue. Karen arrived late, as always, but the effect wasn't the same as it used to be. There was no subtle power in her entrance this time, only the visible shift of people straightening in their seats, eyes narrowing, conversations pausing mid-sentence. She took her seat near the front, setting down a notebook and crossing her arms. The meeting began with formalities, but everyone knew where it was headed. The president announced the agenda item: allegations of harassment, misuse of HOA procedures, and conduct unbecoming of an HOA representative. Though Karen wasn't an elected official, she had served on multiple special committees and had a history of influencing board decisions. One by one, the pieces of evidence were presented. Security footage of Karen tampering with property, anonymous flyers matching her handwriting, records showing that false complaints were filed from her IP address, testimonies from neighbors who had experienced similar intimidation tactics over the years. Each detail chipped away at the image she had cultivated for so long. Karen tried to respond, her voice sharp and defensive, claiming misunderstandings, coincidences, and personal vendettas against her. But the evidence was too specific, too interconnected. Every denial was countered with documentation. Every attempt to redirect the conversation back to community standards was met with reminders that the rules she claimed to defend didn't even exist in the bylaws. The turning point came when a neighbor, one of her former allies, stood and admitted that Karen had encouraged them to file false complaints against Gus's owner. They said they had refused, and from that moment on, Karen had turned cold toward them. That statement seemed to pull the last thread holding her defense together. By the time the presentation ended, the room's mood had shifted entirely. It was no longer a question of whether Karen had done these things. It was a matter of what to do about it. The board retreated for a closed-door discussion. The room buzzed with quiet conversation, the kind of energy that comes when a long-standing tension is about to break. Karen sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Gus's owner sat calm, knowing there was nothing left to argue, only the final decision. When the board returned, the president's tone was firm. The decision was unanimous. Karen was formally barred from serving on any HOA committees, prohibited from filing anonymous complaints, and issued a written warning that any further harassment would result in legal action on behalf of the HOA and the targeted residents. Furthermore, the board publicly acknowledged that Gus's owner had done nothing to violate community rules and commended them for exemplary pet ownership. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was steady, deliberate, and full of quiet satisfaction. Karen's face remained frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. She didn't stand when the meeting adjourned. She waited until most of the room had cleared before slipping out the side door, avoiding the main exit where neighbors were already gathering in small, relieved groups. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, freer. The quiet hold Karen had maintained over the neighborhood for years had been broken in a single evening. But for Gus's owner, it wasn't about winning a personal battle. It was about making sure no one else would have to go through the same harassment again. And as the last of the crowd dispersed, Gus was waiting at home, tail wagging, blissfully unaware of how close he'd come to being forced out, and how much his presence had changed the neighborhood forever. Yet, even with the board's decision, one thing remained true. Karen wasn't the type to disappear completely. She had lost her power, but she still lived 3 houses down. The peace was restored, for now. For weeks after the board's decision, Karen's presence in the neighborhood was like a shadow you could feel but not see. She no longer lingered at the end of her driveway or intercepted neighbors on their morning walks. Her oversized sunglasses and clipboard were gone, replaced by hurried trips from her car to her door. The air was lighter without her constant surveillance, but everyone knew she hadn't vanished completely. Then, one cool Saturday morning, a notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board and in every resident's email inbox. It was brief, formal, and stunning. As part of the resolution to recent disputes, Karen W. will address the community this Sunday at 4 p.m. at the clubhouse. No other explanation was given, but it didn't need one. Everyone knew what it meant. By the time the day came, the clubhouse lawn was packed. Neighbors who rarely came to meetings now arrived early, lawn chairs and coffee cups in hand. Gus's owner stayed toward the back, watching the small crowd grow. At exactly 4 p.m., the HOA president stepped up to the microphone, introducing the statement as part of a formal restorative process, agreed upon by all parties. Then he stepped aside, leaving Karen standing alone at the front. She held a sheet of paper in trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the crowd, but no one offered a sympathetic smile. Even her former allies stood apart, their arms folded. Finally, she began to read. Her voice was low at first, but the microphone carried every word. I want to apologize to my neighbors and to Gus's owner's name for my actions over the past months. My behavior was inappropriate and hurtful. I made false claims, misused HOA procedures, and caused unnecessary conflict in our community. I am truly sorry. There was no attempt at excuses. No side comments buried in her tone, just the plain, direct words the board had clearly required her to say. But the real shift came halfway through when she paused and glanced toward the back, where Gus's owner stood. Her jaw tightened before she forced herself to continue. I acknowledge that Gus is a well-loved and well-cared-for dog, and that he has every right to be here. I will not file further complaints or attempt to influence others to do so. A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the crowd. Neighbors exchanged looks not of pity, but of satisfaction. This was the public reckoning no one thought they'd ever see. When she finished, Karen lowered the paper and walked straight out of the gathering, not waiting for applause or questions. There was no applause anyway. The silence was its own verdict. The HOA president stepped back to the microphone, thanked everyone for attending, and reminded the community that the matter was closed. People lingered afterward, talking in small groups. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood for so long was gone, replaced by a shared sense of closure. That evening, Gus's owner sat on the porch with Gus curled up beside them, watching the sun dip low behind the rooftops. It wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about standing up to something wrong and making sure it didn't happen again. And though Gus would never know the role he'd played in changing the neighborhood's balance, his gentle snoring on that quiet evening was the perfect reminder. Sometimes the smallest ones spark biggest changes. Karen remained in her house, 3 doors down, but she never caused trouble again. Her power had been broken not by shouting matches or endless arguments, but by truth, patience, and the steady strength of a community that had finally decided it had enough. Peace had returned, and this time it was here to stay.